Hello and welcome to Larry Has Opinions. Today I want to talk about the Thomas Cromwell, or also called Wolfhall Trilogy by Hilary Mantel. A very well loved and very well known work of historical fiction that has certainly set a high bar for authors of this genre in recent years. This has also broken through into mainstream culture with a BBC adaptation and having also won 2 Booker Prizes for the first 2 installments of the trilogy, and the third one having made the long list. The 3 books are technically standalones, so you could in theory pick up any of them and read them in isolation. However, I would say that this is probably best experienced as a trilogy, because that will give you the opportunity to really follow the full character arc of Thomas Cromwell and the historical events that he witnesses or that he's part of. With the first book, Wolfhall, starting from very early on in his life and giving us a really thorough background into his humble origins, and the last installment, The Mirror and the Light, extending all the way up to his death. It is a pretty significant endeavor to take on, because the trilogy as a whole is almost 2,000 pages, depending on the edition, and the writing style can be quite dense. And in particular, if you're someone who struggles to keep track of a vast cast of characters, this might be a bit of a challenge. However, there are sections at the beginning of each book that summarize all the characters that feature in that book, so that definitely makes the reading experience easier. So while this might not be for the faint of heart, if you're interested in that period of history and you can make it through the whole 3 books, it can be definitely a very, very rewarding trilogy to read. This all takes place during the Tudor era, so during the realm of Henry VIII. And this tends to be a period of history that most people are familiar with. But I would say you don't necessarily need to have a strong background on the historical events that are depicted in the books to really follow and enjoy the story and feel really immersed in the atmosphere of that time. And it's also quite undeniable that Hilary Mantel's perspective on this period is pretty unique, because Thomas Cromwell has always been depicted, or always tended to be depicted, as a very cunning and ruthless sort of character, and a bit of a villain, really. And Mantel's here is just subverting that trope completely, giving us a very sympathetic portrait of Cromwell himself as someone who, from very, very humble origins, managed to climb up to being one of the most powerful people in the realm. And while Mantel doesn't shy away from depicting him as very determined and ambitious and just ready to cross his enemies to reach his goals when he needed to, she also gives a really significant emphasis to his loyalty and his dedication to service, both when it comes to his previous master, Cardinal Wolsey, as well as King Henry VIII himself, and also to some of the ideals that he is portrayed to hold dear, so just the status and welfare of England as a whole, and also to the cause of Reformation. I don't necessarily want to spend time summarizing the historical events covered in the book here. However, while this remains a work of fiction, from what I gather, and I'm not a historian myself, but Mantel manages to describe these events with a significant degree of accuracy. But at the same time, her authorial voice and intent is very obvious at many points in times. First of all, the tone of the portrait of Cromwell himself, as I just mentioned, but also other portraits are slightly more controversial, like that of Thomas More, which got the opposite treatment, being someone who's typically getting a relatively sympathetic portrait in more official or other depictions. Here gets a bit of a harsh treatment, which again is a bit of a change from the usual narrative. The cast of characters is, as I mentioned, extensive, so there's a lot of Thomases and Catherines and so on to keep track of. However, what I really loved was Mantel's masterful characterization of all these people. Cromwell, first and foremost, is really, really so effective being in his head for such a long time and really being part of his ruminations about his plans for the future, his motivations for doing what he does, and also the impact of his losses from the past that still reverberate onto his present life. But I also loved the portrait of King Henry VIII with his really big ego, but also all his whims and his loneliness and his insecurities as well, just constantly being pushed and pulled by all these people around him. But also a lot of the secondary characters like Suffolk and Norfolk, they're so memorable that it's really easy to find this enjoyable, something that could be really, really dry when it comes to historical fiction. Mantel really manages to keep a lighter and more enjoyable tone throughout the books. And especially when it comes to dialogue, it tends to be always very effective and at times really, really funny with this passive-aggressive comments and jokes that they throw each other. So it's definitely something that was really well executed from my perspective. The tone of the narration tends to be very consistent across the three books. However, the pacing, I have to say, tend to vary quite a lot across the trilogy, because the first and the third book tend to cover relatively broader periods of time, while the second one, Bring Up the Bodies, was really focusing on a relatively shorter time span. This wasn't necessarily a problem for me. However, I have to say that the third book, The Mirror and the Light, was the most challenging to get through. Mantel shows Cromwell increasingly living in the past and reflecting on his childhood and his younger years and so on, which was a clearly deliberate authorial choice. However, I have to say that it felt a bit tiresome at times for me. Mantel's prose is pretty stunning, I have to say. She has this very unique and poetic tone and way of taking the reader through the story. However, I have to say that for me, that comes at the expense of clarity and focus to a significant extent. She can be quite deliberately meandering and obfuscating more than I think it needs to be. She has this dreamlike sequences and stream of consciousness passages that in isolation are really, really beautiful and really effective. But I think in the context of a 2,000-page epic journey, feel a bit indulgent. You kind of read one of these passages the first time, you kind of go, this is really beautiful. And then you read another one and you kind of go, this is nice. And then another one and you go, okay. And another one, and another one, and another one. At the end of it, you kind of go, okay, can we just get on with the story though? I also wasn't the biggest fan of her infamous he that she adopts in Wolfhall, the first book, where so often she mentioned he does this and that, and it's really not clear if she's talking about Cromwell or she's talking about someone else who's just been mentioned, and you kind of have to go back and figure it out exactly who's doing what, which again seemed unnecessarily obfuscating. And then after feedback of so many people complaining about this after the first book, then she goes the other extreme completely. It feels like she's giving the two fingers to all these people complaining because she goes, he, Thomas Cromwell, himself does this and that. I was like, okay, you don't need to repeat it 3 times. It's clear who you're talking about now. So again, that feels a bit patronizing. Anyways. So despite me not being the biggest fan of Mantel's writing style in the context of such an expansive narration, I have to say that I incredibly enjoyed the trilogy as a whole. There are so many moments that she really describes in such a memorable and vivid way. The whole last 10-15% of The Mirror and the Light, which might sound like nothing or only 10%, but it's like 150 pages, so it could be like a novella in itself. That is just absolutely stunning. And I just really enjoy the trilogy as a whole, despite any shortcomings. So for that reason, my rating for the trilogy as a whole is 9 out of 10. I hope you guys like this video. Please give me a thumbs up. If you want to discuss about this trilogy or anything else, join our Discord. The link is in the description box, and I'll see you the next time.